Go ahead. No, okay. I grew up in northern Indiana and lived the first 22 years of my life there. I went back 5 years after that to teach at a university, Indiana Wesleyan University. And then I moved down to Florida lately. I've been down there for 12 years. And as soon as I come back, you decide to have winter. What is this? I mean, I had to scrape the windows this morning off my car and all kind. I said, oh, I forgot. That's what you do. Unfortunately, the rental car had a scraper in it. Otherwise, I might have been a little later getting here. Okay, so I was at the Wade Center a couple days ago, and I talked about a book that I'd written about C.S. Lewis. And it was a fun time. Some of you were there. And I thought today, let's talk some more about this guy. Because I'm not sure how many people really anymore know much about C.S. Lewis, what he's written, what kind of an influence he's had. A lot of people, especially the younger generation, probably only know C.S. Lewis because they have read a series of 7 books. A place called Narnia or something like that, and that's why they have some knowledge of it. But I teach a course at my university on C.S. Lewis, teaching it right now, and I ask my students, first of all, what do you know? What have you read? And most of them have read Chronicles of Narnia, maybe a little bit of Mere Christianity, maybe a couple of them picked up the Screwtape Letters. Maybe a few. Okay? But I'm really kind of surprised that there's not a greater knowledge, a greater understanding of what this man has brought to us as Christians. Now, of course, he's from England. The book that I wrote actually talks about how Americans have received him, which actually is far more than the way his own native country has received him. So Americans are really into, at least the evangelical community, C.S. Lewis. I could take a survey in here, but I think I won't do that as to what you have read of C.S. Lewis. What I want to do is kind of give you an overview. Now, this is my entire semester with my students, all in 1 hour. Is that okay? Except you don't get to read all the things they're going to be reading during the semester, but at least the things that I tell them about C.S. Lewis all along the way. Yeah, his life is important, his writings are important, his influence, all of that is important. And if you want to know how he became a Christian, all you have to do is read a book that he wrote. And now this isn't working either. Okay. But it was working. Okay. Or I could just press my magic button and all my slides would change. Okay. Okay. Did you know that C.S. Lewis started out as an atheist? Okay. Yeah. He grew up in the Church of England, but at the same time, it wasn't very real to him. It wasn't something that he really... Did I do that or did you? Okay, I did it. Okay, that's fine. I just kept pressing things. Okay, we'll see what happens. And if you want to find out about his life, I highly recommend this book. It's his autobiography. It's called Surprised by Joy. And what it means, this title is, as a kid, he just really had these intense longings. He would kind of see something, there would be something happen inside his spirit that just kind of raised this joy within him, and then, of course, it would be gone. And he would spend years trying to recapture that feeling of joy. And what he eventually found out was, quite surprisingly, which is why it's Surprised by Joy, is that it wasn't the feeling he was going after, it was God. And when you found God, then you got the joy. In other words, the joy was secondary. And when you get to the end of the book, what he actually says is the joy is just like if you're taking a walk in the forest somewhere and you're trying to find the path and trying to get to the place you're going to, and you see a signpost there and it points you in the right direction. You say, oh boy, there it is. But once you get on the path, well, the signposts aren't as important after that. Those little stabs of joy are the signposts, he's saying. It was pointing to something. And once he figured out where it was pointing, everything was fine after that. Okay? Are you hearing me okay? Are we echoing here? Okay, a little bit. Okay, something happened. All right. This is what Lewis looked like as a child. I think that's Father Christmas down there on the horse. Okay. He was given the strange name of Clive Staples Lewis, and he didn't like it. And he said at one point, "My name, Jacksy." Why? I don't know. Right? But from that point on, everybody who was his friend simply referred to him as Jack. So it's always Jack Lewis to those who are his friends. Right? He grew up in Northern Ireland, just outside Belfast. In fact, his family saw the Titanic being built just down in the Belfast shipyards. From their house, you could see down into the Belfast shipyards. I had a feeling that was going to be happening there. Okay, are we taking this off?
Just mute it.
Just mute it. Okay, that's even harder.
I think we're done.
Oh, you got it. Okay, good. So now I'm talking this way. All right. This hand has this. This hand has this. When I need to change pages, something has to go. Okay, I'll figure that out when the time comes. All right. But this does sound much nicer, doesn't it? Okay, much better. All right. So C.S. Lewis at a very, very young age. All right. And this was his family home. His father was a lawyer, and so they were, upper middle class, and they were able to enjoy a lot of the nice things in life that maybe some people didn't have. See the house? Okay. Oh, it's an interesting house. I've never seen one quite like that. Okay, but in that home there were books everywhere, and Lewis basically said no matter where he looked, he found books. Books on the bookshelves, books in the hallway, books behind the books. His parents just had books galore, and so right from the beginning he was a man of books. All right. And I'm going to get up there. There we go. Look at that. This is great. Okay, so even as very young, he's somebody who devoted himself to reading. Now, I don't know about you. I was a voracious reader, too, when I was very young. But I didn't have quite what C.S. Lewis had to look at during his early life. He had a brother he was very, very close to. His brother was named Warren. He referred to him as Warnie. And they would go out on all kinds of bike rides. Life seemed idyllic until he was 9 years old. And when he was 9 years old, his mother died. She had cancer. And he prayed very hard, "God, please heal my mother." And his mother died. Now, he says in his autobiography, well, it didn't really faze him all that much, simply as far as the prayer not working. He was used to things not working, he said. So that wasn't what necessarily turned him away from God, but it made it clear to him, at least, that the prayers don't really matter. And so he just went on from there. And he does eventually become an atheist as a result of a lot of things in life. His father, grieving over the loss of his wife, for some strange reason, 2 weeks later, sent his sons to England to a boarding school. Okay? Now, stop and think about that. If you are a 9-year-old who has just lost your mother, and 2 weeks later you get sent over to a school, people you don't know, a country you don't know, you're starting fresh over there. And the school was absolutely awful. The man who was in charge of it was very strict, very harsh on the students. And C.S. Lewis later found out that the school closed down shortly after. His dad moved him out of there, and when he realized how bad it was. But the school closed down shortly after, and the headmaster in charge of it, was put into an insane asylum. That was the kind of schooling that C.S. Lewis was first introduced to. Okay? The next place he went wasn't all that much better. He really told his dad, I need a different kind of thing. And his dad said, okay, I think maybe it's time to give you a one-on-one tutor, the man that I had when I was growing up. He sent him to a man by the name of William Kirkpatrick. For some reason, he had the nickname of the Great Knock. And Kirkpatrick was somebody who was a rigorous logician. He would push Lewis unmercifully to think seriously about, does this really follow? What you're saying right here, does it make sense? In fact, when Lewis first got off the train and met him, he looked around and he made some comments about the countryside, and then the man looked at him and said, you know nothing about this countryside. How can you say anything? That's a good way to start. But you know what was fascinating? Lewis loved it. He liked being challenged on every statement that he made. And I see the hands of those who love being challenged on every statement that you ever make. Okay, my hand is not going up either. All right? Because normally we don't really like that kind of thing. But Lewis loved the sparring, the intellectual sparring that he was getting with this particular man. And this is what made him into a strong, logical thinker. Now, the problem, of course, is that this William Kirkpatrick didn't give him anything spiritual because he also was an atheist. And so all it did was confirm Lewis's atheism during this time period. In fact, we can see a picture of Lewis as the young atheist. He looks a little different there than he's going to look later. Have you ever noticed that how some of us look a little different when we get older? Okay, well, Lewis will too, all right? It happens, to a few people. Okay, fortunately, I still look the same as I was when I was in high school, but, others, have problems, all right? Now, how does Lewis think while an atheist? He writes a letter to a friend when he's about 17 years old, and I don't know if you can probably see all this or not, but I'll make sure I read it all to you so you can, understand what he's saying. He says, you ask me my religious views. I think that I believe in no religion. There is absolutely no proof for any of them. And from a philosophical standpoint, Christianity is not even the best. All religions, that is, all mythologies, to give them their proper name, are merely man's own invention. Christ as much as Loki. Well, we got all these movies out now, Marvel movies with Avengers and things, and so some of you might know who Loki is as a result of that. Okay, but as far as Lewis was concerned back then, there was no difference. Christ, Loki, what does it matter? Right? He said, often, too, great men were regarded as gods after their death. Thus, after the death of a Hebrew philosopher, Yeshua, whose name we have corrupted into Jesus, he became regarded as a god. A cult sprang up, which was afterwards connected with the ancient Hebrew Yahweh worship, and so Christianity came into being. One mythology among many, but the one that we happen to have been brought up in. So you can see where Lewis is at this point in his life. Of course, at this point in many people's lives, they think they already know everything. I know when I was 25, I did. I knew everything then, and I backtracked a little bit ever since then and had to kind of, go follow a little bit different paths in my thinking as a result. But Lewis, even in the midst of all this, still wanted this concept of something beyond just the material world. There had to be something. So he was kind of battling inside himself. There was the logical side of him. Everything had to be proved rationally. And then there was this spiritual, imaginative side of him, which he loved various kinds of stories and, dragons and fairies and fairyland and all this kind of thing, all right? And so he was trying to struggle as to figure out where he really was and try to make these two come together somehow. How do you reconcile these two things? And then Lewis one day is at the train station, and he's looking for a book to read, and he comes across a book written by a man by the name of George MacDonald, and the book was called Phantastes. And Lewis just picked it up, not knowing anything about it, but he read through this, and it was kind of a science fiction, fairy tale kind of thing, and George MacDonald was a Christian writer. And Lewis just really loved this. In fact, he said what it did was it baptized my imagination. Okay? Which is an interesting way to put it. It baptized my imagination. Okay? So now, the problem that Lewis kept coming across, all these people that he really loved to read, he said the strange thing about them was they were all Christians. They seemed to have more depth than anybody else, but he kept resisting this. Okay? World War I comes along. He's Irish. He really doesn't have to go into the war, but he decides to join anyway. And he has a good friend by the name of Paddy Moore. Here we can see Lewis as he looked as a cadet, as he goes into World War I. And they made a pledge to each other. They said, if one of us dies in this war and the other one survives, we will take care of each other's parent that's left. Of course, Lewis had a father. Paddy Moore had a mother. His father had died. In this war, Paddy Moore died. And Lewis kept his word and actually took care of Paddy Moore's mother for the rest of her life, which lasted until 1951. So he kept that promise all the way through. Okay? So even though he wasn't a Christian, he felt it was important that he keep that promise. His father, Albert, he had an on and off relationship with. Albert himself never really understood his son, never really understood the longings that he had, but Albert did support him financially. This is what got him through Oxford. Now, he almost didn't make it into Oxford because one of the exams was math, and Lewis was not good at math. Okay, now, I can identify with that. I was really good with math whenever I was figuring out batting averages as a kid because I liked baseball. Okay? And then when they started putting letters in with the numbers, that really bothered me. I said, somehow that does not compute. It does not fit. So if I have problems with math and Lewis had problems with math, I feel like I'm in very good company. Right? But what happened was, because he served in the war, they didn't hold the people who served in the war to some of those exams, and therefore Lewis was able to get into Oxford. It would have been really strange for an intellect like Lewis not to have been, into Oxford just because he couldn't do math very well. I mean, there were other things he could do exceptionally well. Right? His father gets him through all that. And then he eventually gets his first position at Oxford. He becomes a tutor, a fellow of English language and literature. It's called Magdalen College, even though it looks like Magdalen. And that's where he begins his career in 1925. And that's where he stayed until 1955, until he finally he moved over to Cambridge University then, so he ended up teaching at the two major universities in England. This is actually a couple of pictures of Mrs. Moore and her daughter. So this became, in essence, kind of a substitute family for Lewis. And he made sure that he took care of them best he could. They actually bought a house together, and that house is called the Kilns. They bought it in 1930. It is still there. I went to the Kilns about a year ago. It's actually owned now by the C.S. Lewis Foundation, and they keep it in prime condition, and you can go and you actually visit where C.S. Lewis actually lived. Okay? Now, he's a Christian eventually because he has a talk with a number of people. Like I said, all his writers that he kept reading seemed to turn out to be Christians. It really bothered him because they were just so good. But he was so reluctant to ever surrender his life. Okay? And he said, how do I know? How do I know this is real? There are stories in other religions about, some God dying and coming back to life and the whole thing. And then he has a walk and a talk one night with a couple of friends. One of those friends is a guy by the name of J.R.R. Tolkien. Perhaps you've seen a movie or two. Okay. Or read a book. Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit. Tolkien and another man talk with Lewis deep into the night and show him how we have myths in all these other religions, kind of like what we see in Christianity. But Tolkien relates to him that, what really happened now? This is finally the true myth. And everything else is a copy of the reality of what Jesus did. Okay? And it finally came together for Lewis. Okay? He actually knelt down that night by his bed, and he said he became the most reluctant convert in all of England because of the stubbornness of his heart. That was just a conviction that God existed, but he still had to say for sure, do I really believe that there is Jesus as God? And he relates in his autobiography how his brother drove him. His brother had a motorcycle, and Lewis got in the sidecar of the motorcycle, and they were driving to a zoo one day. He said, when I started out for the zoo, I did not believe that Jesus was the Son of God. When I got to the zoo, I did. And he said, you can't even trace it as to why this big change took place on that trip. But just when he got there, he said, yeah, that's it. That's true. So Lewis was finally convinced. And this changed everything in his life from this point on. All of his writing from this point on is going to be, if it isn't Christian, it's at least going to have that tinge of Christian with it, because he's a professor of English literature, and so he has to write things dealing with that. But at the same time, he's going to be writing Christian books as well. Okay? The first book that he actually writes as a Christian comes out just about a year and a half or so after he does become a Christian, and he calls it The Pilgrim's Regress. Now, that's a little bit of a play on another book, obviously. The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan was a huge seller over the centuries. One of the biggest. Some people have said that The Pilgrim's Progress was actually sold as many books, or almost as many as the Bible. Okay? So what does Lewis do? Why use the word regress? Because he said, well, I started in the right place, and then I left it, and I searched through all these other philosophies and all these other belief systems, and finally I came right back to where I started. I had to regress to make progress, is really what it amounted to. So this is kind of it's an allegory, and really though, if you read it carefully, you understand what it is Lewis's journey to finally finding the truth. It's almost like a personal testimony. Now, the interesting thing is that he actually wrote this primarily just for academics, and there was a woman later who was trying to read this, and she wrote a letter to Lewis, and she said, I'm having terrible trouble. I don't know what this group is you're talking about. I don't know what this person is. I have no idea actually how to understand this book. Now, what do authors normally say to people like that? They say, you can do it. Just hang with it. Lewis told her, drop it. Don't read it. Just forget it. Go on to something else. Okay? He said, I never expected it to go out to a general audience. He said he was fascinated by the fact that other people would actually want to read this. Okay? So that was his first book. Now, what he did on his English literature side, he actually wrote something that was very, very well received in the academic world. It was called The Allegory of Love, and it had to do with the romantic conception of love, and it's very critically acclaimed. This is what made a name for him in the academic world. But then he started again going into Christian writings. Okay? For instance, he decided to tackle a little problem called pain. Okay? Well, how are you supposed to think about pain? What is pain all about in life? Now, he's not a theologian, you understand. And when he starts writing books like this, some of his fellow scholars say, what are you doing? Save that for the theologians. You shouldn't be writing this kind of thing. But Lewis really felt that God wanted him to go in this direction and try to explain things. In fact, at one point in his life, he said, if the theologians would just do their job, I wouldn't have to do this. The problem with the theologians is they talk in such language nobody can understand them. So I'm just trying to explain things to people. Okay? What about pain in life? Why do we have pain? Does God actually use this for anything good? Okay? And so there's some interesting quotes in this book. He says, we are not necessarily doubting that God will do the best for us. We are wondering how painful the best will turn out to be. Okay, nice little quotes that really make the point. Okay. God does want the best for us, okay? But, what does that mean? Sometimes the best for us is to go through something and the pain that's involved with it so that it turns out best for us. He also said in this book, he said, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. How do you get people's attention? When they have pain, then they're willing to listen. Okay? And that's what Lewis is communicating here. Yeah, I got other quotes too. Wow, there's just so many. He says, a man can no more diminish God's glory by refusing to worship him than a lunatic can put out the sun by scribbling the word darkness on the walls of his cell. Okay? You want to try to get rid of God? I'm sorry, you can't do it. That glory is going to be there no matter what you do. Okay? It was this particular book that caught the attention of the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation. World War II now starts. He wrote this book just prior to World War II. And the man in charge of religious broadcasting at the BBC had read the problem of pain, and he's looking for somebody who can be on the radio to try to communicate to the British public during the war and help them to understand, what God wants them to be and how to think during this time. Okay? And he turned to C.S. Lewis, said, Lewis, would you be willing to do some broadcasts for us? Like short 10, 15-minute broadcasts where we, have something you can just get across to people. Okay? And these became known as the BBC broadcasts that Lewis gave. And he started off with just 4 broadcasts. There was so much positive reaction to the 4, they said, can you do 4 more? There was so much positive reaction to the second 4, they said, can you do 4 more? Shall I keep going? There was so much good reaction to the third 4, they said, can you do another 4? And so he did a whole series of these broadcasts. And according to some people, he became the second most recognized voice in England during this time period. Would anybody like to guess the first most recognized voice? A guy named Churchill, yeah, all right. But Lewis became the second most recognized voice. We don't have too many recordings of Lewis's voice, but it is resplendent. I mean, it is deep and it is full and rich, and I can just imagine the way he came across to these people. I mean, there's even a story about a bartender in a pub who is getting ready to, he's got the glass in one hand, he's got the bottle in the other hand, he's getting ready to pour for somebody, and he's listening to Lewis on the radio, and he just hangs there suspended, listening to what Lewis is saying. And the guy wants his drink, but the guy is just hanging there with the bottle in his hand like this, and he's listening to Lewis instead because he's so fascinated by what he's hearing. Okay? Now, what kind of things does Lewis say in this? Well, these broadcasts actually are the essence of what became Lewis's, maybe his most famous book. It was all put together eventually into what we call now, press the right button, it might help, Mere Christianity, which has become a true classic. In fact, Christianity Today did a survey of respected scholars, theologians, and so forth, and asked about religious books that came out in the 20th century, and they said, which ones do you consider to be the most influential in order? Okay. At the top of the list, number 1 was Mere Christianity. Lewis's approach in Mere Christianity was, I'm not an Anglican, even though he was. Okay. I'm not going to come at you as somebody from a particular denomination. What I'm going to do is I'm going to explain to you the essence of understanding God, the Christian faith, what it's all about. And he did it in kind of a roundabout way. He didn't start off by preaching about Jesus. First of all, he said, you ever heard about this thing called right and wrong? and how somehow everybody has a sense of right and wrong. And everybody also has a sense of how they're not doing very well with it. And he works his way into the need for someone to help us and to get past the guilt and to get the forgiveness for what we have done in life, and leads it beautifully into the Christian message. Okay? So when Lewis does this, it's an education for the British public. Britain back at that time was beginning to lose its Christian faith, and Lewis recognized that. And so he knew he had to come at it in this way, start with very, very basics and kind of work your way up. Unlike America today, where everybody knows and understands the Christian faith. Okay, you understand the word sarcasm. Okay, I just want to make sure. Okay, good. Lewis was facing then about the same thing we're facing now, as far as an understanding of the Christian faith. And there's so many good quotes in this. I know you can't probably read that, I'll read it for you. If fallen man is not simply an imperfect creature who needs improvement, he is a rebel who must lay down his arms. This process of surrender is what Christians call repentance. How often is the word repentance left out of our message today? Okay? How you have to have a change of mind, how you have to have a change of direction and go toward God. Okay? It isn't just, oh, would you like to go to heaven? Oh, sure, yeah, I'll pray a prayer. Okay? I'll get to heaven that way. He says you've got to first come to grips with sin. You have to come to grips with what you must do about that sin, and then you look to the one who will forgive you for that sin. Okay? Repentance, a very key concept. He also said, the more we get what we now call ourselves out of the way and let him take us over, the more truly ourselves we become. You were meant to be a certain kind of person, but you got to get out of the way. You got to let God have it. Okay? One of my favorite quotes from Mere Christianity is this one. If I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy, the only logical explanation is that I was made for another world. Okay? And I think everybody has that sense inside them that this is not everything. There is something beyond this. And so what Lewis is doing in Mere Christianity is he's fanning that flame inside of people to want to know what is beyond this and to understand it. Okay? Around the same time, he wrote something that caught the imagination of people. And this is while he's doing the BBC broadcasts. And so you might understand why he's becoming a rather well-known person at this point. Every week he's putting a letter in an Anglican publication called The Guardian, and each letter is from a senior devil to a junior devil, and telling the junior devil how to trip up the one that he's trying to get into hell. Okay? And of course we know that now as the screw tape letters. Okay? Those screw tape letters were very, very popular during this time. Okay, lost it again. I am pressing the right button. Shake it. Shake, shake. Okay, whatever. Okay. And actually, that's what led to Lewis finally being recognized in America, because nobody in America is going to hear the BBC broadcast, right? No, we don't hear that. We're going to have to go with what we can actually read and see, okay? And so the screw tape letters is what spreads his renown over to America. There was a man who became a good friend of Lewis's by the name of Chad Walsh, who wrote the first book about Lewis, and he's an American. And Chad Walsh wrote the book. It's called Apostle to the Skeptics. And that really introduced people even more to who is this man, C.S. Lewis. But Walsh himself, when he did kind of a looking back at Lewis's life and the impact that Lewis had, Walsh wrote an essay once that was called Maybe it's 5 times, that's what does it, I'm not sure. Okay. He wrote something called Impact on America. And I'm trying to show it up there because I'm going to read it in just a minute. I'll go ahead and read it. And he said the following. He said, the combination of urbanity, wit, imagination, and uncompromising orthodoxy of the Screwtape Letters caught the imagination of many reviewers and a large reading public. It has been a long time since this combination of passionate faith and wit had been available, and it contrasted mightily with the dull or heavily strident works of most religious writers. A certain snob quality may have entered into the appeal of the Screwtape Letters. Here at last was a religious book, indeed a specifically Christian book, written with such sophistication and elegance that one need not apologize for leaving it out on the coffee table. You see the Screwtape Letters on a coffee table, and, you know, oh, look, there it is. Okay, now you can look and see if I actually read it right. Okay, so the Screwtape Letters becomes a phenomenon in America, and suddenly people want to know about this C.S. Lewis guy. But the output of his writing just continues to blossom during this time period. In fact, he started with a science fiction book even before The Problem of Pain. I kind of waited to kind of deal with those together as 3 of them. It's a trilogy that he actually put out. And we call it the Space Trilogy. First one was Out of the Silent Planet, in which a Lewis-type person, a college professor, is kidnapped by some rather roguish people and taken to Mars. And because there are people up on Mars, different types of people, and they want to kind of take over Mars. And they're offering Lewis or whoever this guy is as a sacrifice, because they figure these must be, you know, very backward kind of people up there. Turns out they're rather advanced people, and they look upon these guys as kind of like pygmies. And who are you? And nobody's ever sinned on Mars. And they look at these guys who dragged this professor up there, and they say, we don't want you guys here. But what Lewis does in this particular book is he shows that God is in control of all things. And if there are other worlds with other beings, maybe it's not like Earth. Maybe we're not the civilized ones. Maybe we're the ones who are degenerate. As a matter of fact, out of the silent planet is Earth. Why is it a silent planet? Because all the other planets are ruled over by a true angel. He calls him Eldilla. And Earth has been silent for a long time because of this rebellion that took place. And this evil Eldilla seems to rule over that planet. Okay? So this guy comes out of the silent planet. And then Paralandra is the same guy, and now that he understands what's going on, he gets a nice little all-expenses-paid trip to Venus. And when he goes to Venus, he discovers there's a man and a woman there who haven't sinned yet, and it's his job to make sure they don't, so that Venus doesn't become like Earth. But one of the guys who kidnapped him in the earlier book shows up on Venus also, and he's there to argue in the same kind of way that the serpent argued to Eve. And so the man Ransom, that's his name, has to stop this person, this Eve of Venus, from giving in to those arguments. Okay? It's a fascinating story. And finally we get to That Hideous Strength, which comes out about 1945. And That Hideous Strength is about, it's still got the same guy in it. His name is still Ransom, but it's on Earth this time. And down on Earth, there's an organization that wants to take over England, pretty much with occult activities and supposed science combined together to control everything in the society. And it's up to Ransom and his little group of believers to stop it. Okay? We even end up with Merlin showing up in this. It's a fascinating book, actually. The organization then, I thought it's kind of funny the way he did it, that's trying to take over Britain is called the National Institute for Coordinating Experiments, NICE. It's just very nice. We're just trying to take over the world, but we're nice, all right? So Lewis does a nice job with this particular one, all right? That's one of my favorite books, by the way, That Hideous Strength. I recommend getting all three of these, checking them out in order, see what you think about these. That's one thing about Lewis. It's the type, he can write across so many different kinds of styles. He can do apologetics like Mere Christianity. He can do science fiction. He can do funny stuff like the Screw Tape Letters. And the one other one that I like a whole lot is one called The Great Divorce. Anybody in here ever read The Great Divorce? Just one person. The rest, two. What was that? Like what? A play. Oh, you saw the play. It's easier that way. Yeah. It's a short book. You can do it. The Great Divorce. Let's say you're in hell and you'd like to see what heaven's like. Well, you can get on this bus. It'll take you up to heaven. And then you can meet somebody there that's going to try to convince you that you ought to give up yourself and join us. Okay, that's fanciful. Okay, now don't get upset that it might be talking about purgatory or something. It's just a fanciful way. What is it that keeps people out of God's kingdom? And every person that goes up there, except for one, every person hangs on to what they want. It's their own self-centeredness that keeps them from actually surrendering anything. That's the real message of this book. And then there is one guy who has this lizard on his shoulder. That's what you're seeing there in this particular picture. And the lizard is called lust. And the guy wants to get rid of it, but the lizard keeps whispering to it, "You don't want to do that. How can you live without me? How can you know?" And finally, he says, "I've had it. I can't break this, but please do something." So as an angel says, "Can I strangle the lizard?" He says, I don't know. Okay, do it." He strangles the lizard. The lizard turns into a beautiful stallion, and the man gets transformed into a creature of heaven as a result. Okay? In other words, if you only will just strangle these sins, get rid of them, look what God can do. He'll turn lust into something beautiful instead. Okay? And one of the best quotes in this particular book is this one. There are only two kinds of people in the end: those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says, in the end, "Thy will be done." Okay? Kind of a sad quote, but one that I think is very, very true. Okay? Right now, my students they just finished reading The Great Divorce, and now they're reading The Abolition of Man, which is a much tougher read. Okay? Lectures that Lewis gave basically on the concept that we have given up on the idea in our society that there is an absolute right and wrong. We've given up on the idea. We've tried to replace it with something else, and that's going to destroy us when we do that. There's a law that God has put into the universe, and we can never, ever violate it except at our own destruction. Okay? Lots of good things in this book. I know you can't read this one either. He talks about how throughout all of history that we've been taught there are certain things we should like, certain things we should dislike, and he said, and that was real. Okay? And that when we have an emotional kind of chest that kind of speaks to us about what is real. But he says what we've done is we make men without chests and expect from them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. Okay? In other words, when you destroy all the essence of goodness in society, don't be surprised if your society self-destructs. It's a warning that he gives us. He also says, talking about education, The task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. And boy, I can say that for sure. Okay? I've been educating for 30 years, and there's a big desert out there. Okay? I mean, I teach American history, and I ask students, how many have had any? And I know when I teach my big history courses with the survey courses that most of the students sitting there have had so little American history that I'm pretty much writing on a blank slate, which can be good. Okay. They don't have a jungle to kind of cut through. They're in an arid desert. They need something to irrigate their thoughts and to understand things. Okay. Lewis wrote a book in the late 40s just simply called Miracles in 1947. Okay. This one's a pretty heavy one to read. Now, some Lewis books are easy to read, some not quite as easy. But even in the ones not quite as easy, there can be some excellent quotes, like miracles are a retelling in small letters of the very same story, which is written across the whole world in letters too large for some of us to see. In other words, the whole creation is a miracle. And we just don't see it. We don't understand how miraculous this all is. And God, he says, performs miracles. Now, Lewis had a group of people around him. He was kind of like the leader of this group. And that group was called the Inklings. And they would meet quite often in Lewis's rooms at Oxford, and they would kind of look at what they've been writing, and they would kind of share it with each other, and they'd critique each other. Remember, Lewis doesn't mind being critiqued. There are some names up there you might know. At the top is Lewis left, and right next to him is Tolkien. A couple over is Charles Williams. I don't know if anybody's ever read his particular books. So, these are people who would show up along the way, and they would get together and talk. And sometimes, then they'd meet twice a week. After a while, after 1949, they no longer met in Lewis's rooms. They just met at a place called the Bird and the Baby, the Eagle and Child Pub, where they would, meet in the morning, and they would again talk about really interesting things. Okay? And there's a little corner there. Oh boy, that's so hard to see, isn't it? And they got a plaque up there, and the plaque says, C.S. Lewis, his brother, W.H. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, other friends met every Tuesday morning between the years 1939 and 1962 in the back room of this their favorite pub. These men, popularly known as the Inklings, met here to drink beer and to discuss, among other things, the books they were writing. So they would sharpen each other. They would always be in contact with one another. Again, getting Lewis known in America, if you can get on the front of Time magazine, you got it made. Okay, and people will recognize you then. Notice what we have on the front of Time magazine. What do you see there? Oh, an angel wing and then a devil on the other side. So again, it's the screw tape letters that gets the attention in America. Making the cover of Time magazine means somebody considers you worthwhile to be like the #1 story of this time period. Okay? But again, and when we get into the 1950s, Lewis does some writing. Every year he comes out with a book, a small little book that's supposed to be for children, but it's not just for children. Okay? There's a lot there for adults also. A classic series, The Chronicles of Narnia. I say they're for children, and for adults who love them. Okay. I never read Narnia until I was an adult, and I still like it very, very much. In fact, it's like one student said to me, she said, when she heard some of it being read, and she said, I realize that's like for kids, but wow, it's on different levels. The very same thing can be understood as a child and can be understood as an adult, and you get an even deeper meaning out of it. Okay? So these 7 books together, okay? Why does he write these kind of things? Interesting what he said. That's a lion, in case you aren't sure. Okay. He has a name. Okay, Aslan. Okay. He said, when I was 10, I read fairy tales in secret and would have been ashamed if I had been found doing so. Okay. He says, now that I am 50, I read them openly. When I became a man, I put away childish things, including the fear of childishness and the desire to be very grown up. Okay. So now he's going to write for children to understand as well. He actually said in another one of his essays, he said, I thought I saw how stories of this kind could steal past a certain inhibition which had paralyzed much of my own religion in childhood. Why did one find it so hard to feel as one was told one ought to feel about God or about the sufferings of Christ? And he says, I thought the chief reason was that one was told one ought to. An obligation to feel can freeze feelings. But supposing that by casting all these things into an imaginary world, stripping them of their stained glass and Sunday school associations, one could make them for the first time appear in their real potency. Could not one thus steal past those watchful dragons? I thought one could. And so that's why he wrote these particular books. Okay? And there are 7 of them. And of course, probably the one that most people are familiar with is the first one, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Interestingly, though, when I did a survey of people in their reading of C.S. Lewis and asked them which ones they liked best, The Last Battle came in first, which is really the summing up of the entire series, and it ends with a beautiful description of everybody entering into what is called the New Narnia, which in our world would be, of course, the kingdom of God. And it's beautiful as he does that. This is the one I have my students read, because I want them to have that finale, and get that understanding of that. And I figure most of them have read Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe anyway. Okay. But of course it became so well known. These books have sold millions and millions of copies. And of course we had the movie that came out in 2005, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, followed by Prince Caspian and then The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. There have been critiques of those. My book will talk about the critiques that people have of those particular movies. But at least there are attempts to try to bring C.S. Lewis and his concepts to the screen. They're in the process of hopefully still working on one called The Silver Chair. I'm hoping that actually does come to fruition. Okay? And of course, you're not very far away from Wheaton College, and if you want to, you can just kind of go there and walk into the wardrobe and see what happens. Don't go very far into it. And don't take an axe with you to try to chop out the back. It just doesn't work, all right? This actually is one of Lewis's wardrobes. Right? The big change in his life that I've kind of hinted at took place in 1955 when he switches to a different Magdalen, a Magdalen college in Cambridge instead. He made a really important speech that was kind of an inaugural speech that when he went there, and it has some very interesting quotes in that speech. He said, if a live dinosaur dragged its slow length into the laboratory, would we not all look back as we fled? What a chance to know at last how it really moved and looked and smelled and what noises it made. I would give a great deal to hear any ancient Athenian, even a stupid one, talking about Greek tragedy. He would know in his bones so much that we seek in vain. Ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you somewhat as that Athenian might stand. I read as a native texts that you must read as foreigners. In other words, he's saying, I'm an old kind of scholar of things back then. Eh? And he said this too, it is my settled conviction that in order to read old Western literature aright, you must suspend most of the responses, unlearn most of the habits you have acquired in reading modern literature. And because this is the judgment of a native, I claim that even if the defense of my conviction is weak, the fact of my conviction is a historical datum to which you should give full weight. That way, where I fail as a critic, I may yet be useful as a specimen. I would even dare to go further. Speaking not only for myself, but for all other old Western men whom you may meet, I would say use your specimens while you can. There are not going to be many more dinosaurs. So he calls himself a dinosaur. He lives in this age, but he's actually from a different age, is really what he's saying with that. One of his favorite book of all time was one called Till We Have Faces. And not as many people have read that, but it's a retelling of an ancient Greek myth. It's not outwardly Christian, but if you really understand what he's doing with it, he is pointing to the fact that love is, you have to compare real love with selfish kind of love. Okay? And the selfishness is destructive when you do that. Okay? And we got to mention this. Just the fact that he ended up marrying an American by the name of Joy Davidman Gresham, who was Jewish, who had been an atheist, who had been a communist. That's quite a combo. Okay. She basically got saved by reading C.S. Lewis. And she came over to England, and eventually they did get married. I'm just giving you the short version, by the way. And you can see she changes throughout her life. When she came to England the second time, and just before they got married, she was diagnosed with cancer. And they thought she's going to die. Lewis married her, took her home to be with him, to take care of her, figuring she was going to die. She had a total remission for 3 years. They had a 3-year marriage that was absolutely wonderful. Okay? And Lewis said for the first time he kind of understood what it was like to actually be happy in a marriage, because he had never been married prior to this. Okay? She does die, and when she does die after 3 years of marriage, Lewis puts out his thoughts in a little book called A Grief Observed. I could say a lot about that, but I won't at this point. I'll just say it's definitely worth reading. It's very, very personal. It's him questioning God, but eventually finding resolution. Okay? It's probably one of the most personal books that he ever wrote. Okay? He wrote a book called I'm sorry, I'm not there yet. This is how and she was cremated, and here's what he wrote. He wrote a poem for her. Hear the whole world, stars, water, air, and field and forest, as they were reflected in a single mind, like cast-off clothes was left behind in ashes, yet with the hope that she, reborn from holy poverty in Lenten lands, hereafter may resume them on her Easter day. Okay. Interesting. Very well done. One of his final books, not his final, but one of them, called The Four Loves, which he probably could not have written as well as he did if he hadn't been married for those 3 years. And again, this will be probably a little small for you to read, but let me give it to you. He says, love anything, and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully around with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable. In other words, don't put it in a coffin. You're going to get hurt, but that's okay. That's how you learn what love is. Everybody who loves will get hurt. Perhaps you know that there have been movies made about the Lewis marriage. Hollywood gave us Anthony Hopkins as C.S. Lewis. That was not C.S. Lewis. I hate to tell you that. Hopkins had no concept of who C.S. Lewis was. Okay? If you ever really want to read one, see a movie that makes it a whole lot better, I would suggest going to the BBC version of The Shadowlands. It's very well done. It is much closer to the reality. Okay? I've left out one person very important to the C.S. Lewis story at this point, and that's a man by the name of Walter Hooper, an American who went over to England just to have an afternoon cup of tea with Lewis because he'd read so many of his things and was so affected by them. Hooper went over for that cup of tea, but Lewis said, I want you to come to the next Inklings meeting. And he did. I want you to come to church with me. And he did. This was the summer of 1963, and Hooper spent that entire summer with him. And in the midst of that summer, Lewis, actually, this is Walter Hooper more today with the painting of Lewis's home in the background. In the midst of that summer, Lewis actually had a coma, went into a coma. Everybody thought he was going to die. Last rites were delivered. Then Lewis woke up and said, "Do you have any tea?" And Hooper had to tell him. The doctors wouldn't tell him. The nurses wouldn't tell him. Hooper had to tell him how close he was to death. And Lewis kind of commented after that, "If only I could have gone through." He said, it's kind of like Lazarus. He said, "Pity poor Lazarus. He had to die twice." Okay. I would have rather have gone on through, is what Lewis said. But if God says I'm supposed to hang around, then I will hang around. Well, he recovered, but he did die just a few months later. In fact, November 22nd, 1963 was the day that Lewis died. And some of you know that date as the day when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Lewis died the very hour that Kennedy did. You know what I like to think? Everybody's mind was focused on Kennedy. But who had a greater impact on the world? Okay, C.S. Lewis, by all means. Hooper thought, well, that ends that. But it didn't, because Hooper became the executor of the Lewis literary estate, made sure that everything Lewis wrote stayed in print. And he is the reason why we have everything today. Okay? And he also went through all the letters that Lewis wrote. You can find them in 3 volumes, a massive amount. Lewis wrote letters every day. Americans inundated him with letters. Walter Hooper is still alive today. He's in his upper 80s. And if you go over there, you might get a chance to meet him. All right. So I took some students over, and Walter Hooper met with us, shared his experiences of knowing C.S. Lewis. You got to talk about bucket lists in life. That took care of one of my bucket lists in my life. The obligatory picture outside the kilns. Everybody must take that. Okay. Somebody else took one of me. I didn't. I don't remember if I knew they were taking it or not, but there I was. They sent it to me. And of course, you can go upstairs next to Lewis's bedroom and sit at his desk. That looks pretty good too. Okay, when you're there. And why not go by the bird and the baby while you're there, and go to the corner where Lewis and all the other Inklings sat. Okay? It's well worth it. One of my favorite of Lewis's writings, essays, is a sermon he gave called The Weight of Glory. And The Weight of Glory is a fascinating piece of writing. He says things like this, well worth finishing with. Says, "We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition, when infinite joy is offered to us, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are too easily pleased." Wow, what a quote, right? Toward the end of that sermon, I have my favorite quote. "There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit, immortal horrors or everlasting splendors." Every person you talk to is an eternal person, one way or another. Okay. Finally, Britain recognized him as, somebody worth talking about at Westminster Abbey. They gave him a stone. And that's the dedication of the stone there. You can see Walter Hooper on the left, his stepson way to the right, Douglas Gresham. And on this particular stone that is right there, it says the following. It's one of Lewis's quotes. "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." I love that quote. I was at Westminster Abbey last year, Sunday morning service, got up to take communion, walked down the row where my chair was. One of the students with me is pointing down on the floor. Right at the end of my row was this stone. So that was another great day, okay, to actually see that. You can go to Lewis's grave in loving memory of my brother, Clive Staples Lewis, put there by his brother, and then his brother is now buried there as well. And again, you can take a trip to that grave. And the day I was there, there was actually a white envelope on the grave, and it said on it, Jack. Do you know how tempting it was to reach down, pick up that envelope, open it up, and read what was inside? I left it alone. I didn't touch it because I knew that was one person's personal message, and it was not for me. So I left it there. C.S. Lewis has had a major impact. He famously or infamously said to Walter Hooper that last summer, he said, well, in 5 years, nobody's going to remember me or anything that I wrote. And Walter Hooper said, no, you do not understand. What you have written is important. People will always remember it. And because of Walter Hooper, a lot of more people do than would have. Okay. I did write a... okay. Somehow that didn't show up, sorry. I did write a book about C.S. Lewis. It's called America Discovers C.S. Lewis. I had a sabbatical. I read every letter that C.S. Lewis wrote to an American. And from that, you know, kind of came to some conclusions about his relationships with Americans. That book is out there if you're interested. And it's only $200 a bit. No, I'm sorry. It's much, much less than that. Okay. When I was here before, I talked about biblical principles of government. I have a few of those copies in case somebody didn't get it last time and interested in it. I also have a few copies of a book I wrote on a guy you may have heard of, Ronald Reagan, and another guy, Whittaker Chambers, and a comparison between the two people. There's a few copies of that out there as well. But mostly the Lewis book is there, more copies of that, if you are interested in that kind of thing. I hope that this morning, in the midst of trying to keep pressing buttons and changing microphones and everything else, that in the midst of all that, this has been worthwhile. I hope that if you just had a cursory knowledge of Lewis, that this has helped and maybe encouraged you to pick up a few of the books that I've talked about today. Okay. So with that, I thank you very much. Thank you.
We're going to break now. There's only one session today because I wanted to give you a chance to meet and greet the professor in the lobby.